Can you let everyone in the waiting room in? You continue to do that, yeah?
Yeah.
Let all of them in. Mute them. Mute all.
Oh, no.
Les, can you unmute yourself? Okay, Les, I think we've got to start. Les, I'm asking you to unmute. Ah, perfect. Okay.
Okay.
I think we need to start, Les.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar on the Convivencia Declaration, Jewish Perspectives. Please, everyone, read the declaration. Shortly after this webinar, the link should be put into the chat space, along with links to other relevant documents. The declaration is promoted by the Convivencia Alliance, which initially included Jewish Network for Palestine, the Islamic Human Rights Commission, and the Peacemaker Trust, which represent pro-Palestine Christian clergy. A previous webinar featured Christian perspectives on the Convivencia Declaration, so everyone is encouraged to look at that as well. This will be the second in a series on the Declaration. The term convivencia is the Spanish term for coexistence. It retrospectively described El Andalus in the period of Moorish rule, which respected religious freedom and encouraged creative interchanges among the three monotheistic faiths. We use the term convivencia for our cross-faith international initiative for a just peace in the Middle East. This extends the original PLO program to decolonize all of historic Palestine towards building a shared political community as the crucial basis for a just coexistence. Our agenda opposes Israel's racist oppression, brute force, denial of rights, and colonial dispossession. We can ask ourselves, how has this regime been able to continue its colonization process for so long? A major reason, of course, is Western support, which provides political protection and technical military cooperation. Western governments idealize Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, while imagining that somehow, eventually, there could be a two-state solution, as they call it, which, of course, was never compatible with the settler-colonial Israeli regime. It should be called a narrative. This two-state narrative colludes with the colonization process, and now, moreover, colludes with the fascist state that Israel is becoming. Pro-Israel policies are also protected by normalization initiatives, that is, events which normalize the Zionist colonization project by silencing critics. In this country, the government has been promoting so-called interfaith events, which try to engineer a fake, dishonest
You've gotten muted, Les.
Okay, I'll repeat that in case it was lost. So we distinguish this fake coexistence from a just coexistence. Indeed, the three monotheistic faiths have in common the traditional concept justice, which always meant what we call today social justice. This provides an intuitive basis for people's right, motivation, and duty to resist oppression while also building an alternative future. Now I turn to the speakers. They will all take questions from the chat space after they've all spoken, so that's where you should put your questions. The speakers are each representing their own views, not any organization that I mentioned in their biographical note. So we start with Ronnie Kasrils, a descendant of Jewish immigrants from Lithuania, who settled in South Africa at the end of the 19th century. At the age of 21, after the infamous 1960 Sharpeville massacre of peaceful protesters, he joined the African National Congress, led liberation movement against apartheid, and then joined in the armed struggle, rising to a senior leadership position. After the collapse of apartheid, he served as a minister in the democratic government from 1994 to 2008. So Ronnie Kasrils would speak on apartheid and conflict resolution in the South African and Israel-Palestine cases, which have important similarities and differences. So over to you, Ronnie.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's good to be with you all. And it's a very important dialogue that we are involved in here. I'd like to just state that I'm not at all religious. I would call myself an atheist. I believe in the Jewish heritage. And I would in fact say that coming from a very secular family background, they were observers. At the time of my birth, the 1938, very important period, of course, the Second World War and the Nazi Holocaust affecting Jews everywhere, including in South Africa. My parents, I would say, were not Zionist zealots. And the key thing that I learned from them, especially my mother, was the statement of the sage Hillel, and that was about respecting all people. I got that from my father as well, who worked for a factory. And that's a golden thread that unites all religions and believers and non-believers. The question of doing unto others as you wish them to do unto you. And that really affected me very deeply as a youngster. So I've been asked to deal with the similarities of apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel. And let me begin by quoting from a rather prominent South African way back in the early 1960s, long before, and they are latecomers, as important as they are, the B'Tselem statement and report, very important, that of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. Of course, Palestinians have understood it, and the South Africans have too. I'm referring to a South African who stated in that period that that Israel is an apartheid state. He made that statement, and then he went on to say, after all, they have taken the land from the Arabs, he said, who lived there, he said, from the 7th century. So he's talking about 1300 years. It wasn't Nelson Mandela or Joe Slovo, Ruth First. It happened to be the architect of apartheid, and that was Hendrik Verwoerd, who did his philosophy degree in Germany in the early 1930s. Of course, South African Democrats and those out of the freedom struggle, the liberation struggle, are all on record, including myself, those who have been to Palestine. And I'm talking about historic Palestine, the 1948 and the occupied territories and so on, who all have instantly recognized in their trips to the Holy Land that it reminds them absolutely of apartheid South Africa for many reasons. And they've denounced it as such. And this is a huge range of people, including somebody from the South African Christian Institute and also out of the ANC, Frank Chikane, who belongs to the South African Council of Churches and the International Council of Churches, is a very leading person. He's found it quite difficult in the international Christian setup because of the concerns of Christians from Europe, particularly, not just Germany, for calling out Israel exactly what it is. But he's just come back and he's been quite devastating in terms of his report. The United Nations, of course, recognized the issue of apartheid as being a crime against humanity back in the early 1970s. And they provided the definition, which is extremely apt. I'm sure everybody is aware of it, but it's citing apartheid. It's citing apartheid as a crime against humanity. It's not only talking about the South African version, but apartheid applicable anywhere in the world is a model where oppression, segregation in terms of the law is applied by a state representing one racial group against other racial groups or a single racial group in order to perpetuate the privileges of the dominant grouping by all sorts of means. And that really points to Israel. This is why, of course, we understand why the Israelis, the Zionists, in fact, everywhere in the world, react so sharply against this definition, because for them, it's an absolute no-no. They've got to fight it and struggle against that characterization in their attempt to cover up the crimes of Israel and, of course, the Zionist doctrine, which has been about the dispossession of the indigenous people of that land. So to try and deal very briefly in the 20 minutes, and I look to the chair to call me out with 2 minutes to go, the similarities are very, very profound, not only in terms of the visitor who has their eyes open and understands, who doesn't just go into Israel itself, but visits the occupied territories, Gaza, the West Bank, who knows something of the refugees' plight in the neighboring states, people who have been driven away from 1948 and so on. And of course, if you've got friends who are Palestinians living within Israel itself, it also becomes very evident that they live under terms that parallel the terms that people in South Africa suffered under apartheid, highly discriminatory terms of legal issues and so on that they faced. The similarity, in fact, it's quite ironic that in the year 1948, in the very month of May, when Israel declared itself an independent state, with the Zionist leadership under Ben-Gurion, of course, and the whole motley crowd, including dreadful terrorists organizations that made up that particular alliance under Zionism, that it was in 1948, in the very month of May, that apartheid party, Verwoerd's party, came to power in the national elections in South Africa. Both the Palestinians and South African indigenous people lived under colonial systems. The Ottoman system, the empire, was much milder than that of the Dutch, who were here 300 years from the 17th century, and then the British. What is very similar, though, which needs to be understood, is that the colonial aspect of both Palestine, whether under the Ottomans and then later under the British Mandate before the full-blown Zionist oppression and control, and South Africa for 350 years under the Dutch and then the British, and by 1948, full-blown apartheid, both constitute colonial settlement states. So they're not colonial in the generalized sense of the metropolitan country conquering a people and setting up the administration for the extraction of resources and forced labor and so on, but a situation in which both the colonial oppressor group and the colonized people share the same territory. That's a very marked similarity, and of course, it affects the trajectory of struggle and of resistance for national liberation from a colonial regime within the territory of the indigenous colonized people. Other aspects of similarities, of course, are the dispossession of the land, of the rights, of the dignity of the people in both the Holy Land under Zionism and in terms of apartheid South Africa. 87% of the land in South Africa became controlled and owned by the white supremacists, and 13% was left to the indigenous African people. And I think it's well known, these were under the British, and then from 1910, their particular pro-British party, before apartheid came to power in 1948, that they were called the Native Reserves. Under apartheid, there was the issue of imposing Bantustans under the rubric of claiming that land was allowed to the different tribes and groups of blacks in South Africa, and that was the 13% aspect. One can see parallels in terms of the occupied territories that are left to the Palestinians to this day, and what the situation was pre-1947, 48, and then post, and how the land that the Palestinians were able to hold on to was successfully diminished through the 67 war, and then later with the advance of the illegal settlements in the West Bank, etc., and the blockade of Gaza. Of course, this issue of dispossession of land, of rights, etc., in the South African sense, operated in terms of the whole arsenal of laws in terms of creating the segregation of the races, of the peoples. And the aspect there that we get to is the justification for this. And in terms of that justification, we found great similarities in both cases. The reference to a god of the Afrikaner, of the white people, and the god of the Jewish people, who was given the right to the land. And in relation to that, the whole rationalization, reinforced by the fact in both countries that the whites in South Africa coming there and beginning to settle from 1652 claimed that at that stage it was an empty country, that the African tribes at that time were north of the Limpopo River, which is the northern border of South Africa, and were only beginning to move into the empty space, which was populated by butterflies and bees and lions and the like. And of course, the similarity with Palestine as a land without people, for a people without land, is very, very clear. The justification in the South African case was the covenant which the Afrikaners claimed they had with God to deliver their enemies in real biblical terms of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Testament, into their hands, and they would deal with them, and it was all part of the Christian civilizing mission. Very similar aspects. Of course, in relation to apartheid and the aspect of the model of apartheid, it's not that such models are absolutely identical. No countries in the world can be identical. And the differences which relate then very much to the difficulties, I would say, of the Palestinians compared to the South Africans in their similar liberation struggle was the fact of demographics in the key aspect, and the requirement of labor in the South African case. So just to elaborate quickly on that, the issue of demographics, the whites in South Africa, although they were a colonized settlement grouping, were never more than 10% of the population. Makes a huge difference in relation to what has taken place in Israel, Palestine, and we can see there the desperate efforts that are made in terms of trying to turn around the Jewish minority, which, as we know, was a very small minority in the 19th century and at the declaration of the Zionist project, and in fact, right up to the eve of the Second World War and so on. So there was a difference in terms of how the ruling racist colonial powers in both countries were going to deal with the question of the majority and of attaining a semblance of a majority for their particular group. In South Africa, the fragmentation of people was a key factor in relation to the Bantustans, and the fact that the apartheid rulers would claim that they were different people in terms of the whole issue of what apartheid stands for. In terms of the other aspect, which in a sense is similar, but very different, and points to the reason why the Israeli Zionist project has been able to survive against equal strength and resistance of people from Palestine to South Africa, is the issue of Western support. So I think it's well known that in the South African struggle, the Western powers, the former colonial powers, not only Britain, but the countries of Western Europe, and then particularly the USA, were supporting apartheid South Africa. They gave a reflection to a certain degree that they were against the racism and apartheid should reform, but right through they were providing weapons, etc., and particularly Israel against the sanctions program of the United Nations, etc. So in terms of Israel, the West played into, or let me put it this way, Herzl understood Western powers and empires when he talked about a Jewish state would be a bastion, a wall, an iron wall against Asiatic barbarism. And so the Afrikaner apartheid regime played the communist card that South Africa would be a bastion against communist incursion. The collapse of the Soviet Union put pay to that. But anyway, it was never as strategic as Israel is to the whole Western agenda and the US agenda in particular in relation to the Middle East and the whole project of control of resources to the East. Let me end then, Chair, if I've got time still, to come to the resolution of the whole issue. There we see great similarities in the fact that in both cases of the Palestinian people and the African Black people of South Africa, there is a just cause, there is a moral issue in the question of unity, support. This is a vital factor, the international solidarity, and the key project for those throughout the world, and particularly in countries which are supporting Israel and providing it with impunity, is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions program, which the Palestinian movement, through its civil society in particular, are projecting and advocating since 2005. It gives a role for alliances of all kinds, anti-apartheid alliances, the alliance of this Convivencia program to, in terms of Convivencia, recognizing the right to resist of the oppressed people of the area, and for people throughout the world to put pressure on their governments. And so much is important in terms of Western European countries, from Germany and France, from Britain, and from the USA, especially the Arab states in terms of the Abrahamic Accord and so on, but to build up a worldwide BDS movement along the lines that brought down apartheid in South Africa, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, reinforcing the struggle of the indigenous people, recognizing the justice of that struggle and the methods that the people under that oppression and domination would choose. So this, let me end my input by saying, is the major challenge for the Convivencia Alliance. If it's going to work, it needs to take a very strong position, a position which will be unpopular in terms of the media in the West, in terms of the governments in the West, in terms of the corporate business, and so on in the West, and insist on justice, the rights for the Palestinians in terms of international law, and the issue of people going further than coexistence. The South African case shows that what we need to stand for is the integration of a people, the creation ultimately of a united people in terms of building the kind of society in which all people, whatever their backgrounds, religion, tribes, ethnicity, etc., can survive and build together a democracy that fights prejudice from anti-Semitism to Islamophobia, racism, etc., but comes together in terms of people who respect one another and build a better future, a safer future, and a more progressive and prosperous future together.
Okay,
So
thank
that's
you.
the
Thank you. I think
challenge
we've
for
run out.
the Convivencia Alliance. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ronnie Kasrils. Great. Okay. How we move on to Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi, who is media officer of Jewish Voice for Labor, of course, speaking only for herself in this webinar. She was recently elected to the National Executive Committee of the UK Labour Party, and then she was expelled from membership. So perhaps that's tell us something about whether the Labour Party is a safe space for some Jews and not for others. She will speak on a multiplicity of Jewish voices, how Jews who support the Convivencia vision have fought back against attempts to portray all Jews as identifying with the Israeli state, and therefore represent all criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. So over to you, Naomi.
Thank you very much, Les. It's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to speak after Ronnie. What a great contribution that was. I do apologize, my internet connection can be a bit unstable, so I hope it's going to hold up for the period during which I'll be addressing you. I'm going to start off, first of all, I'm going to tell you about an extreme reaction that some people gave to last year's Convivencia launch. Then I'm going to have a look at why it is that the idea of examining the history in the way that we are doing today causes such hostility. Then I'm going to look at the Jewish perspectives, and that will be, as Les has pointed out, it'll be from my personal viewpoint, not on behalf of JVL or any other organization. And then I'll conclude with a reminder of what I said at the launch about the challenges which I think this project will face, or does face. So just to tell you, people may not know this, but back in May last year, after Convivencia held its first public meeting, its launch, a Twitter account, since suspended actually, called @Boz1156, came out with this. It was directed at Jewish Voice for Labour for no particular reason, but it said, JVL is where the cockroaches of Jew hate spawn and grow. They support any Jew hater, and they allow Jew hate to prosper. Jew hate is an infestation, and like all infestations, it needs to be stamped out. Well, that was pretty extreme. You might think that someone accusing us of anti-Semitism would know that comparing Jews to cockroaches is a classic anti-Semitic trope, but clearly not in this particular case. And it made me think, well, why are some people so frightened of Jews evoking the possibility of living harmoniously with Muslims and Christians? It just seems, you know, absurd. And it looks like for some people, it's not permissible to contradict what has been called the lachrymose view of Jewish history. The idea that for 2 millennia, Jews have been subjected to unmitigated hate and persecution. It serves a purpose for those who insist that the only path to safety for Jews is to create an exclusive haven where security is guaranteed by a strong military allied, and Ronnie's alluded to this, to the most powerful forces on the planet. Some of you may be familiar with John Rose's book, Myths of Zionism, in which he explains that the favored narrative has been that Jewish communities spreading across the Middle East, Asia, Europe, and finally into America in the many centuries following the fall of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Common Era were, quote, powerless, downtrodden, subjected to unrelieved persecution, close quote, and that this could only be alleviated by transferring all Jews to the historic home, in the words of Theodor Herzl, in Palestine. Rose says that the reality is far more complex than that. He calls this Zionist myth a crass insult to the dynamism, mobility, and immense creativity of the Jews. He says Zionism has forced Arabs and Jews apart in a way that runs against the grain of the long history of Islamic Arab civilization. So scroll down a bit. I mean, we mustn't be too starry-eyed about this. Jews and other non-Muslims certainly suffered from outbreaks of intolerance and violence at times under Muslim rule. We mustn't overplay the idea of a golden age of Jewish-Muslim relations. I come across an interesting paper by Mark R. Cohen of Princeton University, who explores the myth and reality of this period. And he says, in the Islamic hierarchy, everyone had a rank, including non-Muslims who occupied a low rank, to be sure. But he adds, it was a secure rank nonetheless. Jews occupied a permanent niche within the hierarchical social order of Islam. And though marginalized, they were not ostracized or expelled. The Jews of Islam had substantial confidence in the dhimma, the taxation system. If they kept a low profile, paid their annual poll tax, they could expect to be protected and to be free from economic discrimination, not to be forcibly converted to Islam, massacred or expelled. To be sure, the system occasionally broke down, but serious persecutions were exceptional. I mean, there may be people who have a different analysis, but this is from a pretty authoritative source. He makes some illuminating observations about the role of language, which I found interesting. He says, by the 10th century, some 2.5 centuries after the rise of Islam, Jews had made a total and largely effortless transition from Aramaic to Arabic, and now used Arabic not only in daily speech, but for nearly everything they wrote. This prepared them to share lock, stock and barrel in the high culture of Islamic society. Islam came into contact with the science, medicine and philosophy of the Greco-Roman world centuries earlier than European Christendom. I'm going to move on to talk about my particular Jewish perspective. Let's think what a modern day convivencia means. For me, it's about Jews fighting for justice for all, alongside Muslims, Christians, and in fact, people of all faiths or none. A fundamental point we must not lose sight of is this: the notion that Palestinians are fighting Israelis or Muslims are fighting Jews in a religious war is a toxic notion and must be rejected. I actually have a very personal perspective on this issue. I'm the granddaughter of Jewish refugees from Poland, Russia, Germany, and Ukraine, people who fled anti-Semitic pogroms in the late 19th century and escaped to the UK before the Racist Aliens Act of 1905, which blocked further undesirables like my grandparents from reaching safety here. We have to keep reminding our British friends that the architect of that piece of legislation, Arthur Balfour, then Home Secretary, became the Prime Minister who gifted Palestine to the Zionist movement in 1917, hence the well-known Balfour Declaration. My late husband was a Moroccan Muslim from a large family based mainly in Amsterdam by the time I met them in the 1980s, but inextricably linked to their home on the Atlantic coast of North Africa, some distance south of Agadir. Traveling with them in southern Morocco and reading the fascinating history of the place, I learned how Jewish communities used to be interwoven with their non-Jewish neighbors in desert towns on the cross-Saharan trade routes, dating back even before Islam. And actually little changed in this regard until after the foundation of the State of Israel, which prompted most Jews to leave their Arab friends and neighbors. Again, let's not be starry-eyed about it, but this does seem to be a reality because old people in Morocco remember a harmonious time which preceded the advent of Zionism. And tragically, among the young, strong sympathy for the Palestinian people is often twinned nowadays with hostility not only to Zionism in Israel, but also to Jews. I was unaware of this history until quite recently, but I had already in the 1960s begun to consciously dissociate myself from the frequent linkage of Jew Zionism and Israel. I feel as if I've spent the last 50 years explaining that being Jewish does not necessarily mean backing Israel, right or wrong. So my trajectory during that half century took me to 9/11 and its aftermath. And along with millions of others, I could foresee the outcome of the invasion of Iraq and the war on terror. And I joined Jews for Justice for Palestinians. I joined Palestine Solidarity Campaign and found that it was full of Jews, as well as Christians and, of course, some Muslims. I was involved with forming Jews for Boycotting Israeli Goods, which had the slogan, kosher to boycott Israeli goods, which I can assure you didn't go down terribly well with the mainstream Jewish establishment. But the idea was that we were supporting the growing boycott, divestment and sanctions movement that Ronnie quite rightly stressed the importance of. We were attempting to defend it against a growing campaign of demonization using the anti-Semitism allegations that we're now so familiar with. We were involved with high-profile collaborations with 2 central London churches, for example, on successive Christmases, an event called Bethlehem Now, where carols were sung with alternative lyrics, highlighting the oppression that Palestinians face in the occupied town where Jesus is reputed to have been born. Not many people in this country know that Bethlehem is a predominantly Christian Palestinian city. We've worked with groups like the Amos Trust and the World Council of Churches, their ecumenical accompaniment program in Palestine and Israel, EAPI, on social, cultural, and educational events, powerful collaborations which consciously bring together perspectives from multiple faith backgrounds. Joining the Labour Party in 2015 has meant working with as many people as possible, whatever their religious or ethnic background, supporting a political project led by Jeremy Corbyn, which had justice and equality for all at its heart. I'll conclude with a reminder of some of the things I said at the launch last May. We need to put forward a critique of existing organisations and structures that purports to be creating interfaith dialogue towards a solution in the Middle East, but in fact, they uphold Israeli hegemony. Examples include Tony Blair's Interfaith Foundation, the Three Faiths Forum, renamed recently Faith and Belief Forum, the Council of Christians and Jews, Christians United for Israel, the Wolf Institute, Solutions Not Sides, and there are others. These all tend to use the language of conflict between 2 opposing sides, as if there is equality between the Israeli state and the oppressed Palestinian people. They function in some or all of the following ways. They normalize racism and settler-colonialism, accepting the language of Zionism as a form of Jewish self-determination. They call at best for a 2-state solution, which ignores freedom, justice, and equality for Palestinians, the goals of the BDS movement. They promote the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which equates opposition to Zionism with hatred of Jews. They give cover to the Christian Zionism, which is behind much church interfaith activity. Fundamentally, they perceive interfaith work as Zionist Jews working with people of other faiths, pressuring them to identify with Zionism. And they promote the idea that pro-Palestinian activism, especially BDS, is anti-Semitic. There are a very few faith-based groups working on Israel-Palestine that have justice and equality at their core. This is to date the brief of human rights, international law-based groups, not faith groups, such as Amnesty, B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, obviously Palestinian groups such as the Institute for Middle East Understanding, Al-Shabaka, and many pro-Palestinian BDS groups. I think Convivencia Alliance has a tough job ahead if it hopes to move interfaith dialogue from what it currently tends to be towards promoting collaboration among and between Jews, Christians, and Muslims who desire justice and peaceful coexistence, as so beautifully described by Ronnie, for all in the Middle East. We know that peace and coexistence depend on embracing justice for Palestinians, and that entails challenging two-state rhetoric and the IHRA definition. There are radical younger Jews who understand this, but they place a high value on remaining integrated in traditionally Zionist, synagogue-based Jewish communities. Those communities show little sign of readiness to question Zionist orthodoxy. Not wishing to end on an entirely gloomy note, we must hope that here in the UK, as in the US, the shock of the extremist, right-wing, racist Israeli, explicitly racist Israeli government that is a threat even to democracy and rule of law for Jewish citizens, that this may provide an opening for a project like this. And I look forward to hearing the discussion from the other speakers and people in attendance. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Naomi. That's great. Yeah, I'm sure we'll take up those points in the discussion. So next we turn to Professor Daniel Boyarin, who is presently the Herman and Sophia Taubman Professor of Talmudic Culture in two departments, the Department of Near Eastern Studies and the Department of Rhetoric at the University of California at Berkeley, emeritus. He is also professor of the graduate school there. He will speak on the idea of national vitality without sovereignty. His talk will draw from his forthcoming book, The No State Solution, a Jewish Manifesto. So over to you, Daniel.
Thank you. I think that I have, well, first of all, I would like to put the blame on Haim Bresheeth if my talk is somewhat incoherent. My tendency is to read from a paper, but I was asked not to, so I'm going to do my best to be spontaneous and coherent. My talk is in a sense, and I will try to keep within the time. I mean, I will definitely keep within the time, but I'll try to do so easily, is a renewed understanding of the term convivencia in this context, and an elaboration on it. First of all, the last thing that I imagine as being a positive step, and in this I agree with Naomi, is interfaith dialogue. Right? And when I first saw the first inklings of something about convivencia, I was afraid that that was the unfortunate direction in which things were going, for multiple reasons. Not least is that anything that emphasizes the question of religion and religious difference in this context is always going to lead to negative results. I think that I'm picking up and agreeing with some of the points that Naomi made in this context. So I'd like to begin by reading a very short couple of sentences that were written by Aimé César, the deputy for Martinique, of course, to Maurice Thorez, the Secretary General of the French Communist Party in October 1956. Césaire wrote, "I'm not going to confine myself to some narrow particularism, but I do not intend either to become lost in a disembodied universalism. I have a different idea of a universal. It is a universal rich with all that is particular, rich with all the particulars there are, the deepening of each particular, the coexistence of them all." Coexistence, as has been remarked, can be translated exactly as convivencia. And what I feel has been perhaps underemphasized or lacking in many of these conversations is the positive question, the question of how we imagine different groups, and I will call them different collectives. I don't want to identify them as religious or ethnic. How we can imagine different groups living together without them becoming disembodied, deracinated, as in the image, the writing of many universalists, and which César was himself resisting, and he is indeed one of my great heroes, Aimé Césaire. And for this, I think that actually Jews have a fitting model in our own past historical existence, namely the model of diaspora. To my mind, and here I find myself frequently in disagreement, or in resistance, in a position of resistance with regard to my closest political friends and allies, and moral friends and allies. To my mind, the continuation of, let me say a forbidden word for a moment, national existence, different national existences, and I'll very quickly elaborate what I mean by national here, is a value and a necessity for vibrant human life. Now, quickly, lest you all shut your ears immediately because I said national, which sounds very much like Zionist. In this context, I do hope that most of you know that I am a long-term anti-Zionist activist, very close to the same sources, human sources that Haim Bresheeth comes from in Matzpen, and a longtime supporter of BDS. So when I say national, I do not mean nation state. Nation state. I mean the kind of nationalism or nations that were imagined in the latter part of the 19th century, in particular, within the contexts, indeed, of the great empires. I don't necessarily think that empires are a good thing, but it was in that context that the idea of nations as groups that shared language or languages, often enough, shared a history or a historical memory, shared a sense of connection, frequently imagined as a kind of family connection, which is not the same as race or racialization, certainly not necessarily, and certainly not in the modern sense, the 20th century sense of race. And that this vitalized, gave vibrancy to their collective lives, their collective cultural lives, production of literatures for the first time in languages such as Czech, and others of the languages of Eastern Europe, for example, the kind of national sensibility that that produces not only national literatures, but other kinds of writing and practices and shared practices. And that comes out of the devotion of members of that collective and their mobilization to maintain in creative and critical ways the traditions, customs, languages, practices that have informed the history of the peoples that they come from. Now, an equally powerful motivation for me, at any rate, and for many others, has been exactly to the sense of a shared commitment to justice for everyone, and not what César calls, of course, and rejects, narrow particularism. And the question of how to make that kind of coexistence, César's coexistence, alive, has live and even thinkable, denkbar, let alone possibly to come into existence, has occupied my mind for something like the last half century in different ways and to different degrees. And I have increasingly the sense that diasporic existence is what enables that. So let me I'll quickly define what I mean by diaspora. For me, diaspora has nothing to do with, not nothing to do, but very little to do with Lacarimos interpretations of Jewish history or of anyone else's history. Diaspora, I define, I identify as a condition of dual cultural and social commitment. That is to say, commitment to the culture of the place where I am living. Okay. Dort, wo ich lebe, dort ist mein Heimat, the old great Bundist slogan. By the way, you should know, I come from a family in which one grandfather was a Bundist and the other was a yeshiva person. So it's not entirely inexplicable that I am, as my friend Shaul Magid calls me, a neo-Bundist, neo-Haredi. Right? So that commitment to justice in the place, particularly in the place where I live, and that place where I live can be defined closely or more broadly. And secondly, a cultural commitment and identification with other collectives of people who are not in the same place, but who share important, significant cultural connections of language, shared history, shared narratives, etc. This is, to me, the definition of diaspora, that double commitment, and the project is to maintain both of these commitments with as full equal energy and devotion as possible. This is for me the model of convivencia, of actually existing convivencia, like actually existing socialism in that sense. of a possible framework for rethinking, first and foremost in this context, the existence of Jews in this world and in the places where we live. So for me, a commitment to Black Lives Matter, I live in California, a commitment to Black Lives Matter and a devotion to Yiddish summer camp, or in my case, particularly to the study of Talmud, not as a religious act, but as an act of Jewish cultural survival and critical creativity, and the space that this opens up to be with others who, on the one hand, share together with us, Ronnie, our commitment to justice for everyone in the place where we live, but also have their own exciting, vibrant, cultural, national lives in the same place and as political equals. This is my image of the possibility of real convivencia. So I'm going to stop there, even though I hope I have
thanks.
conceded some time to others.
Right. Well, without reading out word for word, that was great. So now we come to the final speaker, Professor Haim Bresheeth-Zabner. He was active for several decades in the Anti-Zionist organization, Motzpan, which originated in Israel-Palestine, and then many of the members became exiles in London. He's been an editor of the journal Hamsin. He's a founding member of Jewish Network for Palestine. He's also active in BRICUP, the British Committee for the Universities of Palestine. He's now a professorial research associate at SOAS. His latest book is An Army Like No Other, How the IDF Made a Nation. So over to you, Haim.
Thank you very much. And it's quite an experience to follow three such illustrious speakers. And it's an excellent experience because I can refer to big names and real thinking, which was displayed here, and I will. I'm the only Israeli on the panel, to the point that I'm Israeli after all those years. And I want to talk about Zionism and Jewish identity from my particular background, but I think I share this with many on this webinar. First, let's remember that Zionism is a modern invention. It really starts at the end of the 19th century. And at the beginning of the century, it represented less than 1% of all Jews in Western Europe. It never went above 2% in Western Europe before the Second World War. This is also true about Eastern Europe, though the conditions there were, of course, very different, as we well know. And while in Western Europe, after the French Revolution starts a process of liberation and emancipation of Jews, different nature in different country for this process, but it starts and it goes ahead slowly but surely. And this has not happened in Eastern Europe in the same way, but this support of Zionism in Eastern Europe was also in the 1 to 2% bracket. Of course, Daniel has mentioned the Bund which also forms part of my own family. My family was basically divided three ways: communists, Bundists, and Zionists. My parents were Bundists, but many of my father's brothers, who I didn't meet bar one, were actually communists. Now, this is also true about North America, where, you know, probably the largest group of Jews live today outside of Israel, and even maybe including Israel. The support for Zionism was minuscule until the Second World War, and really not meaningful, also in Britain, until 1967. So and I should also add that in the Arab world, despite a very great difference, the Arab world Jews did not suffer, and Naomi is related to this very accurately. They did not suffer from the kind of racism and discrimination that Jews in Eastern Europe suffered, of course, but the support for Zionism was low, also because of that, but also because the links between, you know, the Arab Jews and the Jews of Europe and North America were not very strong, and Zionism has not advanced into those communities, and there was no reason also to support Zionism. So all in all, we're talking about a minuscule movement. Out of 2 million Jews that left the Pale in Eastern Europe and went abroad, 1% of them went to Palestine. They could go to very few countries, of course. Until 1924, they could go to the United States. After 1924, it was very difficult for them to go to the United States. It's very interesting to note that in the United States, Jews were basically working class as they arrived, most of them. And they were left-wing, and many were communists, and many were communists even in the 50s, when it wasn't fun to be a communist in the United States. In Britain, the Board of Deputies was hostile to Zionism, and when the only Jew in the Balfour government, Lord Montagu, heard first about the idea to write what became known as the Balfour Declaration, he said it's an anti-Semitic idea, and he is against it and voted in cabinet against it because he thought it will give the anti-Semites and, you know, a way of speaking about Jews that would exclude them from Britain. Just go to Palestine, what are you doing here, kind of thing. Now, Zionism starts as a secular movement, but there were also religious Zionists, not the type of religion that we now see in Israel. I hasten to say, those groups were much closer to my friend Daniel in their you know, views on Zionism. That there were two main groups, the Mizrahi and the Aguda, and they were very left-wing Zionism, because these were, you know, the Aguda was called Poalei Agudat Israel, the workers of the Aguda, and Mizrahi also was a left-wing government, a left-wing party. So these were parties of workers in the Pale of Ukraine and Russia. Now, of the Israelis who were, or I should put it differently, in 1948, less than 10% of Israelis were religious of any kind. If you look at all the types of religion, then less than 10% of them were religious. And Ben-Gurion was a bit worried about that because he was very anti-religious himself, but he needed the religious parties to govern Israel. And they actually got out of him quite a few financial measures that supported the yeshivot, for example, the yeshiva students. Now, I just want to remind you, and this is not in disagreement with what Daniel has said, which I totally agree with, but to remind you that Shlomo Zand is mentioning that in two of his books, at least, which I'm sure all of you know, that Jews were not ever a nation in the way we understand nationality. Nationality is a modern concept. It probably is not known in the way that we understand it now, before the French Revolution, definitely, but even later. And it's a 19th century construct. So in that sense, you can't talk about a nation of Jews during the Roman time or before in the same way that we talk about modern nations. So for Shlomo, Jews are not a nationality, but a religious and cultural group, or a number of groups. And I'll come to why I say a number of groups. So what started as a secular collective in one area of the world, in Palestine, has very quickly spread all over the globe, even in Roman times. So we know that in Roman times, most Jews lived out of Palestine, even though accepting that there was not a forced expulsion in the way that Zionism is describing. People just went to places which were better to find jobs, better paid jobs, more interesting things to do. Palestine was a backwater. Now, I want to say, and I hope that Daniel will also speak about it later on, if there are questions on this, because I'm very interested to read his book, which is about to come out. I don't think there ever existed a single type of Judaism anywhere. What do I mean? I mean, for example, that the God of Moses is not the God of Joshua. The God of Moses is a God of which, concentrates on morality and social morals, and the other one on brutal occupation, extermination, and destruction. I don't know how many of you read the book of Joshua. If you haven't, it's not a fun read, but it's a very important one. The God of Jeremiah or Amos is not the God of King David. So I want to say, and that I think, Daniel, you might disagree with, the Hebrews and later the Jews created their God in their own image. Hence, the God of Moses was a universal moralist, while the God of Joshua was a militarized ethno-nationalist settler-colonialist, because that was what supposedly happened in Palestine about 3,200 years ago, or thereabouts. We don't know exactly, of course. So the various gods represented socio-political systems at the time that they were created, they were conceived socially. So the Joshua God is Elohim Tzvaot, the God of the hosts or the God of the armies, and is described as El Kana Venokem, a God of zealotry and vengeance, because that was necessary, according to Joshua, to drive the clearing of Palestine of its indigenous people. Now, David, in his book, is talking about the Lord is gracious, our Lord is full of compassion. I don't think one would describe the God of Joshua in the same manner. Yeah. Remember that the God of Joshua is telling Joshua, everything has to be destroyed, but the silver and gold and vessels of brass and iron are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. And the sentence later, and they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and ass, with the edge of the sword. Now, it's really interesting to note that actually there is no any archaeological evidence for the destruction of Jericho, which the sentences I read relate to. So there is no such evidence. Also, Israeli archaeologists have made this clear over the last 20 years. There's no evidence of the Exodus. There's no evidence that 600,000 people have walked the desert at any point in time. So if there is no evidence, it doesn't mean to say that the myth, the Joshua myth, is not important or is not dangerous, because this is the myth that is feeding Israel today. So what is really interesting is that from a movement in which the religious element was basically just accepted with reservations, though. We are now looking at Israel, which is basically a Sharia state on the way to become the Judaic Republic of Israel. And those people who are directing its religionization process are not of the kind of religion that Daniel is believing in, of course. So this is a very interesting and very toxic development. Think about Israel as a colonial state of settler colonials, specifically settler colonials rather than just a colony. It's a specific form of colonialism that existed, for example, apart from South Africa and Algeria, also in North America and Australia. And in all of those places, it was extremely destructive to the indigenous population. So this is how we describe Zionism, I think. It's part of a small group, but important group of colonial regimes, the most destructive ones. And because they are built on replacing the local population, the indigenous, with the incoming population. Now, to that, add the fact that at least since Netanyahu comes to power, religion is added to that mix in a very toxic manner. So the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians is ratcheted up by this kind of process of adding religion to racism, to settler colonialism, to nationalism, which is ethno-nationalism. In other words, the conflict is on all possible levels of existence. So that's why the Israelis now are on very good terms with almost every Arab state, but they are on total conflict and clash with the Palestinians on every level possible, not just political, not just cultural, not just religious, not just colonial, but all of those, in a sense, interpose over each other. So this is a total conflict model. And now I want to come to what we are now facing in Israel, because I think we haven't talked about yet, and we need to talk about that. Okay. In the chat, there is a document. Unfortunately, it's only in Hebrew. I'm still translating it into English, and I hope by next week to have it on our website. It was written by Bezalel Smotrich, who is the Minister of Finance in the new government. He's from the religious Zionism bloc. He's the ideologue of that bloc. He's probably not the most powerful in the bloc. He's number 2, but he is the most worked out. And this was published in a journal of the extreme right in Israel called Hashiloach. And the link to that, for those of you that can read Hebrew, is in the chat. Now, he's now not only the Minister of Finance, which obviously is somewhat an important ministry, but he's also a minister in the defense ministry. So he's not a defense minister, but he's a minister in the defense ministry looking after the occupied territories. In other words, he is now able to raise armies, private armies, like, you know, what the Russians have done in Ukraine and elsewhere, and the Wagner group, you know, so this is a model that now is becoming possible with the new legislation and the new administrative duties that those ministers have. He has written a very long document in 2017, which is called the Tipping the Scales Program, or Tochnit HaHachra'a in Hebrew. And I have not time to actually go into it in detail, so I'll just tell you very briefly what this is going to do, or is already doing. He's saying that there is no way in which 2 nationalities can coexist in Palestine. And when he wrote it 5 years ago, what he wrote it for is to kill the dead body, already dead for decades, of the 2-state solution. So he's saying the 2-state solution, apart from being non-Zionist, is unrealistic. Even the Zionist left refuses to satisfy the minimum expected by the most restrained Arab leader in Judea and Samaria. The language is the language of the Israeli right. Arab means Palestinian because they don't want to admit the Palestinians exist. And Judea and Samaria is the West Bank, of course. So this is the language he uses throughout. So from there, he says, what we need to do is to have one national state and one national collective in the whole of Palestine, which he calls Eretz Israel. So what we are now having is, remember what Ronnie told us about South Africa, have this in mind. We are now moving from the de facto to the de jure apartheid in Israel. And he says, only when one of the sides will give up its aspirations willingly or unwillingly will peace come. As we have no intention of giving up our wish for self-determination, it must be the Arab side that must do so. West of the Jordan, there is space for one national entity, and a Palestinian state does not exist and will never be allowed to exist. What does he remember? He talks about the Arabs in the whole of Eretz Israel. In other words, he talks about not just the 4.5 million Palestinians who have no right whatsoever to live anywhere, in a sense, but also the 2 million Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, not full citizens, but they're still citizens, though they are losing their right as we speak. So he's talking about near 7 million Palestinians, more than half the population of Palestine at the moment, because it's larger than the Jewish Israeli population. And he is telling them that they will have to leave. The two options he presents are those who are ready to give up national self-determination, because that's a condition for him, will be able to stay and live here and enjoy the great plenty, progress, and excellence brought by the Jewish people. They will be residents rather than citizens, without the rights to vote and be voted for, and without rights for self-determination whatsoever. Two, those who are not ready for this will have to leave to one of the many Arab countries or somewhere else, and we will help them to do so. And what happened to those, which will be the majority of the population in Palestine, who don't want either of these? In other words, they want to be in their country, and they've proved that, and they want to have self-determination, and they proved that. Those who will refuse to leave and will choose the third option of violence against the IDF will be dealt with by the security forces much more resolutely than we do today, and in better conditions for us. The permanent solution, listen to that, must be built on the total removal of the Arab hope for a state between the river and the sea. And
you need to finish now.
Yeah, I'll just read you an important thing, which is, I must find, it's such a long document. Those that need killing will be killed, and efficiently, by the IDF, which is well provided for that duty. So I just want to use 2 minutes at most
I think you need to finish because you've gone over 20 minutes.
I have?
Oh, well over. Yeah, I think
Okay.
it's good for the discussion.
Okay, sorry. I thought you're going to give me a warning. So thank you very much. I hope that you will join our battle to achieve peace and a just peace in Palestine, and a single democratic secular state for all who live there and for the Palestinian refugees. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Okay, now we move to the discussion, and I'm expecting to receive some questions, but meanwhile, let me take the liberty of posing a couple of questions for any of the speakers who want to answer. I mean, Haim has reminded us that the colonization process, which was always the main driver of the Zionist movement, will now certainly intensify in a more systematic, militarized way than even before. And of course, there will be more protests here and perhaps even there. By here, I mean in the places in the diaspora or Western countries in particular where we all live. But the Convivencia Declaration aims initially to try to transform the political context where we live, in relation to Israel-Palestine. And I'm just going back to Naomi's talk about interfaith events. I mean, this reminds me, the declaration had many sources, but one source was our realization several years ago that fewer and fewer Muslim groups were explicitly opposing the Israeli colonization process because their leaderships, at least, were being drawn into these fake, interfaith events, we call fake coexistence, which were being strongly promoted by the Home Office with a set of carrots for those leaderships who participated and sticks for those or against those who didn't, and even stronger sticks for organizations which continued to campaign against Israel's colonization. So I want to pose a couple questions. How do you see the prospects for people supporting the Convivencia Declaration to organize events attracting people from all faiths and none on that basis, of opposing Israel's colonization process, its settler colonial basis, and so on? And secondly, what aspects of Jewish heritage, culture, religion could we best bring to those efforts in order to engage other people? So for any speakers who want to respond, and meanwhile, I'm hoping to receive some questions in my chat box. So just looking, yeah, go ahead.
I'm prepared to respond briefly, Chair, if you recognize me. Ronnie here.
Oh, yes, yes. Well,
Okay.
obviously you're already unmuted, so go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Sure. I unmuted myself.
Right.
I think it's been absolutely fascinating listening to everybody here. In response to the 2 points that you raised, the question of support for this project is twofold, maybe threefold or more, but let me just focus on two. One is what we're doing, the conversation, the awareness, the analysis. That is very important to develop that amongst Jewish people, believers or non-believers, people who believe in justice. And of course, the interaction with people of all faiths and no faiths, not just Jews, is very important indeed. The question, though, is one's got to go beyond discourse. We've got to translate theory into practice. And that means action. That's what's going to move people. That's what's going to mobilize people. That's what's going to change the situation, contribute to that change. And that's why the weapon for the international community is BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. We haven't really heard very much about that here in the discourse. I'm not being critical. This is part of a process which we're engaging in, but I just want to emphasize that factor. Then there's the second point, Chair, the issue of the Jewish position. I just want to give a comparison in relation to South Africa and South Africans of all races, ethnicity and color, fighting to overthrow white supremacy, a la apartheid in South Africa. And of course, the people who really suffered and were under their heel were the Black people of various shades of color, indigenous Black Africans, but also the influx through the colonial project of slaves in the Dutch Cape Colony from the 17th century, and these were Indonesian and Malaysian people. My wife, Amina, who comes from that background, a descendant of such people. It's a big group in South Africa, sometimes referred to as mixed race or colored people. Of course, there was the integration between Black and white and Indian and colored, etc., and then also the Indian people. So they formed the motive force of the struggle against apartheid, the Black working class, the African masses, etc. There were very, very few, a minute number of white people from some really committed liberals. And I know that can be a perjured term, but those who actually really physically involved themselves and some who went to jail, there were lots, well, it's a minority of a minority, but there were communists, there were Jews amongst them, etc. Quite a remarkable number, about 50% of the whites who became involved, and we're only talking about a couple of thousand or so over the years, probably half actually were of Jewish extraction, and many from Eastern Europe or trade unionists from Britain. But it had an enormous impact, that minority, because it undermined the racist mythology and the idea that the whites had to stand together absolutely united against the zwart gevaar, the black danger, the rooi gevaar, the red danger, as apartheid and their supporters from the Western powers would refer to the communist threat. So one, I believe, cannot underestimate the importance of Jews throughout the world taking a stand, a full stand, without reservation, in support of the freedom of the Palestinian people. And that should really inspire those of us here, Jews and non-Jews, etc., but speaking specifically to the Jewish communities everywhere, to be involved and to know that they can make a difference, and the importance of all of us internationally being involved in the BDS movement. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for filling the gap in the talks as regards the BDS movement, which of course we all support.
Can I?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
To add to Ronnie's excellent intervention, I want to add this. Jewish Network for Palestine is trying to work with Jews in Britain. We are in Britain. In a similar way that JVP works in the United States, and JVP is not the only organization that does this. In the United States, we have seen great changes in the young Jewish population. Maybe Daniel can tell us something about that, I'm sure. And the young Jewish population is now much less supportive of Israel than it ever was, and less than its parents and grandparents. And they are increasingly supporting Palestine. And we've seen also the beginnings of Haredi synagogues who are anti-Zionist. Also Daniel will know more about this than we do. I just want to say that what we have now done in Jewish Network for Palestine is wrote to our members, and now we are going to write to Jewish organizations in the UK and ask them to have conversations in which we are prepared and happy to be involved. And we have presented them with 7 questions. For example, is it part of Jewish identity to be a military settler colonial? Is it part of Jewish identity, or sits easy with Jewish identity or with your own Jewish identity, wherever you are, to support apartheid? Is it right to steal land? Is it right to support the kind of behavior that Israel is imposing on the Palestinians directly or indirectly under its control every day? Is it right that Jews are killing at least 1 person a day since the beginning of this government, and that the last government killed more than in the last 2 decades? And we're talking about killing people who are unarmed, and children, people who with health problems that can't understand what is happening around them, that are killed in cold blood. So we now want to start a conversation in the Jewish community, and this will not be easy. And Naomi said how difficult it is going to be. I think she's right, but we are preparing to intervene in at the moment there is a monologue. It's the Jewish community is supposedly united behind Israel. We are the proof that this is not true. Not just socialist Jews are against this altogether, but of course a lot of Jewish Haredis are against it. A lot of Jewish liberals are against it. And the question is, how do we get this agreement onto the open market of views? And we are not sure how easy or difficult it is going to be.
Okay, thanks. And I think Naomi wanted to respond to the questions I posed.
Yes, Les, I appreciated the question that you put forward there. I mean, the fact is that, yes, leading Muslim organizations are sort of sucked into this normalization narrative, and that's obviously very difficult. There are exceptions, of course there are. We of course should be working with those Muslim organizations, and particularly, as Naomi Fall in the chat has said, with Palestinian groups. But I mean, I really do think it is a massive challenge, and the fact that it looks like everybody on this call seems to be already, totally committed to BDS, which I am, and I know, Les, you have been for years, and trying to pursue it and trying to make very clear that there's nothing inherently anti-Semitic about boycotting a state which has been found now to be guilty of the crime of apartheid in many respects. The trouble is that for many Jews have been convinced that it is anti-Semitic. We've had this massive campaign for recent years, and I think that by declaring up front BDS is the way, which I do in my activism, I don't see that as being a very good way of getting a hearing in any mainstream Jewish organization or community, unfortunately. So, I mean, I want to pursue BDS. We must pursue BDS. I would like to see an opening up of dialogue with people who are more mainstream in the Jewish in the various Jewish communities, but I don't think you can do them both at once. I think we've got to find a different way in. What Haim said about saying, do you support militarism and murder? And well, no, but they're not going to be open to talking to us if we approach them in that way. I mean, it's really a difficult one. How JVP got to be where it is fantastic, and I would love to be able to emulate the reach that they have, particularly among younger Jews in America, but younger Jews in the UK who do share quite a bit of our analysis are very tied to trying to work within the confines of the organized Jewish community. So, we really are in a double bind here. So I'm sorry to be critical, but, I think we must be realistic and try and find ways. I'd be very interested to hear what Daniel has to say, because obviously he probably has the most experience of any of us of working with organized Jewish communities, and there may be others in the audience as well who can contribute.
Yes, thanks. I mean, actually, my question was more about how we can engage whatever relevant groups there might be among Muslim and Christian communities in order to undermine the prevalent form of interfaith events, which normalize the Israeli regime, and at the same time to create some ongoing alternative, to create a different kind of future. So perhaps Daniel could say something about means to do that.
Just a few considerations. First of all, the US community in general, not just the Jewish community, seems to me to be so much more heterogeneous, so much more nuanced, less centralized. In particular, I am talking about the Jewish community, after all, than the UK. That is a significant difference. Secondly, as to JVP's success, and I have been a member of JVP since it was 5 people around the kitchen table in Berkeley. So I won't say that I have been prominent in the organization, but I've certainly been with it all along. A not insignificant part of JVP's success has been to offer what I take as a sincere commitment to Jewish life and Jewish existence, not in the sense of working through the so-called Jewish community, but by presenting possibilities for alternative Jewish community, so that I think particularly young people who have been attracted to JVP over the decades, it's now something like 20, 25 years, have not been made to feel that they were in some sense abandoning Jewish community, but rather providing or finding an alternative kind of Jewish community. And that I don't think that has been a tactic or even a strategy. I think that has been largely the product of many, many, many committed Jewish people who were either at the outset or fairly early on associated with JVP. So that's one important thing. Secondly, someone asked earlier about and suggested that I might have something to say about shifts and developments in the American Jewish scene. And I believe that they have been tremendous. I came to the United States 32 years ago, from Israel, where I had lived for 17 years. And Haim, I carry an Israeli passport also. So I sign all the petitions that ask for Israeli citizens to sign as well. I came here 32 years ago and had an amazing experience. Whereas in Israel, where I taught at Bar Ilan University, I was somehow intelligible as an anti-Zionist Orthodox Jew, right? Sort of a kind of modernized Neturei Karta or Satmar type, it fit into a cultural framework. When I came here in the beginning, I was simply unintelligible. People just thought, this man is crazy. How can you be a professor of Talmud and Shomer Shabbos and keep kosher and that has shifted completely over the last 30 years. Now there are many, many in the Jewish professoriate and in other leadership capacities, and actually former leaders of the American Zionist movements who have shifted their positions. It's now, I'm not going to say it's a majority opinion by any means, but the notion that all Jews or all committed Jews are Zionists has very, very significant cracks in it now in Jewish communal life. So I'm not sure that working too hard within, and I do say the so-called Jewish community, because Jewish communal leadership is not identical to Jewish community, neither in Britain, the UK, nor in the United States. That's what I have to say at this point.
Okay, thanks. And we have a little time left for any questions from other participants. I haven't received any. Perhaps our system isn't working as I expected, but I saw someone raise the orange hand, electronically speaking. So we can just go to you directly. That seems to be the only way. Is there anyone who wants to raise a question? Oh no.
It looks as though Les has disappeared. Ines Murray, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute and put a question?
Yeah, my question is more open, and it's to do with the current trends to do with world. It's to do with the neoliberal order, and especially what we've seen from COVID, which is the huge amounts of resources going into fewer hands. Do you think there will be more of a demand for Israel's service in a material sense, but as Israel is a leader in surveillance and control? I think that touches all aspects of community life. Jewish or
Thank you.
non-Jewish.
One of the speakers want to respond. Haim, please.
Israel seems to me to be already making a fortune from selling surveillance, advanced surveillance materials, programs, etc., to the most repressive regimes, let alone the neo-liberals that form Amazon.com, etc., in the United States.
Haim, did you want to come in?
Well, you know, my recent book on the IDF deals with that in detail, but I can say that the arms sales, including electronic and digital means of controlling populations, have more than doubled since the war in Ukraine started. Israel is rolling in money, not the Israeli citizens, of course, but the government is rolling in money coming in. And therefore, I think that the very uncertain situation that the war has created, and that also Trump has created, and now Biden is creating by basically speaking in the way he does about China and Iran, is going to give a lot of business to Israel. So that's one way of looking at it. I don't know if you meant this, but also there is the flip side that an American president that has to pay between 50 and 60 billion dollars a year to Ukraine for no good result or reason is going to be more limited in paying the $4.5 billion that he pays to Israel. So Israel is going to face also problems, not just bonanzas.
Thank you, Haim. Naomi, I think we're due to finish very soon. So, but please go ahead.
What I was going to say is, if there isn't much time, then I'll cede my time to other people. I saw Diana Lesden had her hand up a minute ago, for example, so I'll wait.
No, you're the only one with a hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, the other person has disappeared.
Yeah, no, I find that Aeneas's question is very interesting, and just to give a sort of anecdotal touch to this, that there was a program on the radio the other day. I sort of habitually listen to radio for, despite its shortcomings, discussing a cyber attack which had struck a group of secondary schools in London, and it was a really serious one. It was ransomware which shut down their systems and put them into terrible difficulty. And their answer, they couldn't find anybody to help them. But when they did find somebody to help them, guess what? It was an Israeli company. And the guy speaking about it said he was full of admiration because these people were all military trained and they really knew what they were doing. This was the group that was brought in to find a solution to the ransomware. A friend of mine said, well, maybe they put it there in the first place, but I wouldn't want to suggest that that was the case, of course. So, I mean, I do think that it's not just surveillance, it's not just drones, it's not just military equipment, it's also the expertise that people gain working for the Israeli military and security services has many uses, and it is a difficult one in a neoliberal world where such considerations, commercial considerations, are very important.
Welcome back, Les. I'll let you take over.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I'll just briefly, before I mention the Western government support as a crucial basis for the Israeli colonization project to continue, potentially, indefinitely. And a central part of that is the European Union's security challenges program, in which Israel has played a leading part and benefited financially and politically by developing these kinds of technologies. And I will just go to Diana. I think that will need to be the final question before we conclude.
Okay, really what I want to say is that I've had some contact with working with the interfaith community for morally responsible investment. There weren't many, there were 2 Jews, and there were mostly Church of England people who complained bitterly about the lack of concern among the princes of the church about Palestine, or even about the Christians in Palestine for whom they had responsibility, pretty much like us here, the Jewish communities, about the leadership. But what's interesting about there are obviously Muslim people in Convivencia, but I meet young Muslims in my own area. I live in a very diverse area, and I have many young friends. And they tell me they are their friends and their community don't believe that there are any Jews who are against Israel. And that is why I wanted to have a meeting sometime about who speaks for the Palestinians, and ask some Jews, so that the local Muslim community who feel that no Jews actually speak for about Palestine or for the Palestinians could actually learn something about those of us Jews who I call us dissidents, although and clearly we are not persona grata among many people. There is a major concern about trying to reach out to Jewish people. And I like what Daniel says, that if you meet people where they are, in the things that matter to them, in the culture that matters to them, it might be more effective than actually approaching them with a political view. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thanks for the suggestion. Yes, that's a challenge. Approach people perhaps on a cultural basis. So we've already gone for almost 2 hours. Thanks for most people still with us. So to conclude, we'll hand over to Stephen Sizer, who is currently the chair of the Convivencia Alliance. So he will briefly recap what that is and how we see some next steps.
Les, thank you very much. I don't have access to my video. Hussein, can you allow me to use my video? Otherwise, I'll just do it verbally.
Yeah, just
I've tried to undo my video and it says you can't start the video because the host has stopped it.
We'll do it. We'll do it in a minute. Just looking for you on the list.
Oh. Oh, there. Yeah. Under
what name do you appear, Stephen, on the list?
He's near the top.
I've sorted it.
I'm Stephen.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
On behalf of the Convivencia Alliance, I'd like to express a warm and hearty thanks to Ronnie, Naomi, Daniel, and Haim for your clear and compelling presentations, and also the challenges you've laid before us as the founding members of the Alliance. Your presentations, we hope, will be online very soon, so we'll be able to benefit from listening and watching them again and sharing them with others. This is, as Les has said, the second in a series of webinars. We've had the first presenting a Christian perspective, and now we've had a Jewish perspective, and we look forward in the near future to hosting a third webinar, which will look at a Muslim perspective, and then following that, a fourth one that will focus on secular perspectives on convivencia and how we can create a coexistence based on justice, peace, and reconciliation, especially in Palestine. Please visit the website. It's brand new, convivencia.uk, and share the resources that you'll find there. Please help us to grow the Alliance, endorse the declaration, and through the opportunity you'll find on the website to make contact, please give us your ideas and thoughts for the way forward. I've made a list of some of the discussions that we need to take forward from today for the year ahead, issues such as apartheid, IHRA, BDS, and so on. And if you are able, we would appreciate you to give financially to the work of Convivencia to help us to grow it. You'll find a donate button on the website. Please make use of that if you feel that's appropriate. So thank you very much for being with us this evening. Thank you once again to Ronnie, Naomi, Daniel, and Haim, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar very soon. Thank you.
Can I say to the speakers that we intend, those of you that are still there, don't leave a second, we intend to publish the series of talks of the Christian perspectives, Jewish perspective, and the next two as a book or as a journal issue, whichever will be easier. And that will be done soon. I'm about to write to you all and ask that you write it into an article, which I think will be a great service for people who missed that. And of course, they will be able to see the recording, but a book is a book and it stays.
Mm-hmm. That's fine by me.
So write it down, Naomi, everything that you said today. I know, I'm just joking. But it will be a very interesting, because it'll be something like 15 or 16 papers, very different ones on all the perspectives on this idea.
Great. Okay, thank you to everybody. I better go. Getting peckish, could do with some dinner. Great to see you. Great to see you, Les.
Seeing you all
Thank you very much.
virtually.
Cheers.